You know the story of the baptism of Jesus. It began at the lowest point on earth, and that point is not at the bottom of the ocean. It is on dry land, in a deep fissure where the planet's crust is literally tearing itself apart. In this place, the air is denser, and the atmospheric pressure pushes the body down in a way that is not felt anywhere else. And it was on this geological stage, in this sort of open wound of the world, that this event took place, an event that ended up defining the course of history as we know it. To decipher the reason for this specific location, the artificial intelligence axiom received a single mission: to analyze the geographic and historical data of a specific stretch of the Jordan River, known as Bethabara. We fed the system with everything we had, from topographic maps and climate models from the 1st century to historical texts from that era. The question was direct. Was the choice of that point an accident, a random decision by a traveling preacher? Or was it something calculated, with coordinates defined thousands of years before? The answer the analysis gave us was mathematically clear. The chance of all the factors that aligned in that location being a simple coincidence was so small that it bordered on the impossible. That was not just a river. It was a stage set with frightening precision. The Jordan River runs at the bottom of the Great Rift Valley, an immense tectonic fault line that stretches from Syria to Africa. Geologically speaking, it is a zone of constant tension where the Earth's plates are separating. But the most important fact the data pointed out was the altitude, or rather, the lack of it. The baptism site is glued to the Dead Sea, which is the lowest point on the entire surface of the Earth. We are talking about 400 meters below sea level. You have to stop and think about what that means. To reveal himself definitively, the creator of the universe did not choose the peak of a mountain, like Everest, to be seen by everyone. Instead of a palace in Rome or the steps of the temple in Jerusalem, he chose the deepest geographical hole on the planet, a choice that inverts the entire dynamic of power. While kings and emperors build towers to get closer to the sky, the movement here was the opposite, downwards. The ancients called this movement kenosis, the act of emptying oneself, of diminishing oneself by one's own will. The geography of the Jordan Valley turns this abstract idea into something you can see and feel. Jesus descends into the deepest crack in the earth to begin his journey upwards. It is the lowest possible point. From there down, there is nothing else. The very word Jordan confirms this. In Hebrew, Yarden comes from the root yarad, which means to descend or to fall, the river that descends. It is born on Mount Hermon from pure melted snow and descends with speed, cutting through the land, getting dirtier and heavier with the clay and silt it drags along until it dies in the Dead Sea, a lake from which no water escapes, a symbol of the end of the line. The river is the perfect image of the human journey, from a clean origin to a descent full of obstacles and impurities, ending in a place without life. And it is into this current, into this murky and heavy water, that the one considered the purest of all enters. He enters the flow that symbolizes decay to turn the tables. The geography, however, is just the beginning. Historical data crossed with the coordinates of Bethabara revealed what we call historical resonance. Bethabara, which in Hebrew means house of the crossing, was not just any crossing point, it was a historical portal. The algorithms found a perfect match. The baptism site was the same geographic point where, 12 centuries earlier, the people of Israel, led by Joshua, finally crossed the Jordan to enter the Promised Land. The scene was dramatic. After 40 years in the desert, following the death of Moses, Joshua leads them to the riverbank. The name Joshua in Hebrew is Yeshua, exactly the same name as Jesus. The first Yeshua made the people pass through the water to reach the land. The river opened and they passed on dry ground. 1,200 years later, in the same place, the second Yeshua, Jesus of Nazareth, takes the reverse path. He does not cross over, he enters the water. The first led the people through the water to the land. The second enters the water to lead humanity through death to heaven. It is a complete rewrite of the code. The historical depth goes further. There is another memory engraved in those coordinates. It was there that the prophet Elijah ascended to the heavens. Elijah struck the water with his cloak. The Jordan opened and he was taken up by a chariot of fire. His disciple, Elisha, stood on the bank, inheriting his mission. The symmetry is striking. Elijah goes up to heaven at the same point where, centuries later, the Son of God would descend into the water. The earth-heaven movement is inverted to heaven-earth. The heavens that closed for Elijah were about to open for Jesus. Bethabara was a portal, a place where the membrane between worlds was thinner. The stage is set, the lighting is perfect, the audience, formed by simple people and suspicious Roman soldiers, is already positioned. The stage waits for the protagonist, but before he enters there is another man there, a man dressed in skins with a voice that sounds like thunder in the desert. Who is he? A madman? A rebel? Or the last messenger of a world about to end? That man dressed in skins was not a random madman. He was the only piece that could unlock what was to come next. In any complex chemical process, before the main reaction happens, a catalyst is needed. A substance that accelerates everything, that creates the conditions for transformation, but that often consumes itself in the process or withdraws at the exact moment. Human history is full of leaders and revolutionaries, but when analyzing the events of the first century, the artificial intelligence highlighted a figure that fits no standard profile. A man who was less of a person and more of a function. A vector pointed at a single target. We are talking about John the Baptist. To understand the depth of what happened at the Jordan, we need to know exactly who was the man holding Jesus' head. Why couldn't this ritual be performed by the high priest in his golden robes at the temple in Jerusalem? Why did it have to be a wild hermit on the edge of a muddy river? We fed the system with all available historical data about him, from the mentions by Flavius Josephus to the Dead Sea Scrolls and the four Gospels, to build a complete profile. The result was impressive. He was not just a preacher, he was an instrument perfectly designed to shatter reality. The accounts say he wore a garment of camel's hair and a leather belt. A historical reconstruction of this look shows something interesting. Raw camel hair is not a soft fabric. It is a rough and prickly material used to make sacks or tents. Wearing it against bare skin meant condemning oneself to constant physical discomfort. It is the opposite of relaxation, a continuous irritation on the skin that does not allow the body to rest for even a second. This choice of clothing was a visual code for the people of the time. It was the uniform of the ancient prophet Elijah. The message was clear: Elijah has returned. The analysis of his diet reveals another layer: locusts and wild honey. Traditionally, this is seen as a symbol of extreme poverty. However, a biochemical analysis reveals fascinating details. Locusts are pure protein. Wild honey is concentrated glucose and micronutrients. This is not the diet of a starving man. It is the diet of a special forces soldier on an autonomous survival mission. It is high-performance fuel for an organism operating at the limit. John was not a weak and exhausted man. The modeling of his physical form suggests an individual with incredible endurance, capable of living in the desert for years, withstanding temperature variations from 40 degrees Celsius to 0. His speech revealed the same toughness. When he shouted, "Brood of vipers," or warned that the axe is already at the root, he did not use the tone of a gentle spiritual counselor. It is military rhetoric, direct and aggressive. There is no room for diplomacy. John's social compliance index was 0. He called the nation's elite a nest of snakes. He publicly accused King Herod Antipas of adultery. From a self-preservation standpoint, John's behavior was suicidal. But it was this absolute honesty, bordering on recklessness, that turned him into a magnet. The people were tired of the corrupt and complicated hierarchy of the temple. They needed a voice that didn't come from a manual, and they found it in the desert. Near the baptism site in the caves of Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. They belonged to a closed religious community, the Essenes, who withdrew to the desert to wait for the end of the world. The comparison between the practices of the Essenes and those of John shows remarkable similarities. The Essenes practiced daily ritual baths of purification, lived ascetically, and quoted the prophet Isaiah about preparing the way in the desert. It is very likely that John grew up or was trained in this environment. The Bible says he was in the deserts till the day of his showing unto Israel. However, the analysis identified a fundamental breaking point. The Essenes were a closed sect. They hid from the world, considering everyone outside impure. Their purification baths were only for members and were repeated. John rotated this vector 180 degrees. He went to the people. He was open to everyone: soldiers, tax collectors, prostitutes. And most importantly, his baptism was a unique event. It was not a hygiene procedure to be repeated. It was a profound change of mind, a point of no return. John's mission was to prepare the ground. Imagine that people's hearts were dry, cracked soil. John came to plow this land, breaking the stones of cynicism and indifference, so that the seed Jesus would cast could germinate. Without this rough and preparatory work, Christ's message would have encountered an impenetrable wall. And then the crucial moment arrives. In the crowd of sinners, among soldiers and common people, appears a figure that does not emit the same signal of imperfection as all the others. Metaphorically, it is as if amidst hundreds of heat signatures a completely cold one appeared. John feels it. His biological senses, tuned by years of fasting and prayer, begin to vibrate. He sees the one he has waited for his entire life, but instead of joy, he feels a shock. "I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me?" This is an error in the program. The precursor tries to stop the king. The servant tries to stop the Lord. The logic of earthly hierarchy screams that this is wrong. But Jesus was about to break that logic, and why he waited 30 years to do it. The scene freezes in that instant of shock. The man who attracted crowds to the desert, the voice that made kings tremble, now hesitates. His hand, accustomed to the harshness of wildlife, recoils before the one he should baptize. "I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me?" The entire human logic is contained in this phrase. The lesser cannot bless the greater. The imperfect cannot purify the perfect. It is a protocol error, a glitch in the hierarchy system that governs the world. To understand the depth of this moment, we need to solve a paradox that has intrigued historians for centuries. Accounts indicate that John and Jesus were relatives. Their mothers, Elizabeth and Mary, were close. Genetically, there was a bond between them. So how could John later say, "I did not know him"? Did they never see each other in 30 years? The artificial intelligence, upon analyzing this apparent contradiction, suggests that the answer lies not in a lack of social knowledge, but in the absence of a divine confirmation. The most likely explanation is that they may have crossed paths in childhood or youth as distant relatives. But John, who grew up in the brutal discipline of the desert, and Jesus, who lived a common life in Nazareth, followed parallel paths. The phrase "I did not know him" does not mean I have never seen this man before. For the analysis, it means I had not received the divine signal confirming his identity until this exact moment. John was programmed to wait for a specific signal, an event that would activate his final recognition. Until then, Jesus was to him, perhaps, just a just and silent cousin. Back on the riverbank, John is the star of the moment. All of Jerusalem comes to him. He has authority, power, and the fervor of the masses. The people are ready to declare him the Messiah. The ego of anyone else in this position would have become inflamed. But John's profile shows a unique psychological anomaly, the complete absence of egocentrism. When asked, "Who are you?" he responds with denials. "I am not the Christ. I am not Elijah." He defines himself by what he is not. He is just a voice, a sound preparing the way for the word. This absence of personal ambition is crucial. If there were any trace of ego in John, the meeting at the Jordan would have been a conflict, two powerful leaders vying for the same space. But John understands a fundamental law of spiritual physics that he himself formulates. He must increase, but I must decrease. He sees his own popularity not as a goal, but as a launching pad for the other. His mission was to climb as high as possible, only so that the transfer of attention to Jesus would be even more impactful. That is why, when Jesus approaches, John's sensors, sharpened by years of isolation and focus, go off. He is not just seeing with his eyes, he is perceiving a different signature. Amidst all the spiritual static of the crowd, all the noise of human flaws, he detects a perfectly clean signal, a pure frequency, and this purity is what shocks him. His job was to deal with dirt, and now purity itself was asking to be treated as dirty. Jesus' response breaks the impasse. Let it be so now. It is proper for us to do this to fulfill all righteousness. The word righteousness here does not have a legal sense. It means fulfilling the plan, executing the divine protocol as it was written. Jesus is not asking to be purified. He is identifying himself with the people he came to save. He does not jump the queue. He does not ask for special treatment. He puts himself in the same position as everyone else in the dirty water, waiting for his turn. It is the definitive act of solidarity. He becomes one of them to be able to rescue them. Upon hearing this, John understands. He does not comprehend the logic behind the plan, but he recognizes the authority in the voice. He consents. And then it happens. The hand of the man of the desert, the catalyst, touches the head of the one who is the reaction itself. It is the official passing of the baton. From that moment on, John's curve of influence, which was at its peak, begins to descend, a path that would lead him to prison and death. And Jesus's curve, which started at point zero, shoots towards infinity. The hierarchy protocol was broken for a greater purpose. The natural order of things was inverted to establish a new order. But this raises another fundamental question. Why now? Why did Jesus wait 30 years in silence to take this step? What cosmic clock struck exactly at that moment? The logic of time was about to be revealed. Time is not just a river flowing in a single direction. To physics, it is the fourth dimension of space. To a historian, it is a sequence of events. But for our analysis, time is a mathematical matrix where each occurrence has a unique identification code. And that leads us to the question left open: why did Jesus wait 30 years? Why live in complete anonymity, as a carpenter in a forgotten village, before taking the first public step? To decipher the time factor, we gave the artificial intelligence axiom the task of synchronizing all historical calendars, astronomical data, and political chronicles of the first century. The goal was to understand what was so special about that moment. The answer lay not in a single variable, but in a perfect convergence of multiple clocks, all chiming at the same time. The process began with the biological clock. The evangelist Luke mentions that Jesus was about 30 years old when he began. Why this age? Modern neuroscience shows us that the human brain, specifically the areas responsible for strategic planning, impulse control, and complex decision-making, only finishes forming completely between 25 and 30 years of age. At 30, a man reaches the peak of his physical and intellectual capacity. It is the flourishing of strength. Jesus does not present himself for his mission as a young idealist, nor as a tired elder. He enters the scene at the moment of maximum biological efficiency of a human being. He offers God his prime, not his leftovers. Simultaneously, the cultural and religious clock was running. The number 30 is not random. It is an access code in Jewish culture. In Old Testament texts, the age for Levites, the temple servants, to assume their full duties was 30 years. Before that, it was just training. Joseph in Egypt was 30 years old when he presented himself to Pharaoh and became governor. King David was 30 years old when he began to reign over Israel. The prophet Ezekiel was 30 years old when he saw the heavens open. The analysis identifies a clear pattern, a protocol of maturity. In the ancient world, a man under 30 had no authority to teach in public. He would not be taken seriously. Jesus, even being who he was, submits to this social law. He does not use divine shortcuts to speed up the process. He waits for the earthly stopwatch to reach the right mark. This brings us to the 18 years of silence, the period between age 12 and 30. What did he do during all that time? The conclusion is that it was not a time of passive waiting, but of active calibration. To be the redeemer of humanity, it was necessary to first live the human experience completely. He needed to know the weight of a hammer, the pain in the muscles after a day of work, the price of bread, how people laugh at weddings and cry at funerals. It was a period of total immersion in the human condition, not theoretically, but empirically. At 30, this integration process was complete. His human nature was fully formed, ready for the mission to come. It is a demonstration of almost incomprehensible patience, having all the power of the universe and spending 18 years just working, observing, and waiting for the signal. Finally, there was the political clock. That historical moment was not chosen by chance. The world lived under the rule of Tiberius, a dark and paranoid emperor who governed Rome from his exile on the island of Capri through fear and denunciation. Pontius Pilate, his representative in Judea, was a brutal administrator who despised local traditions and was always ready to crush any sign of rebellion. Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee, was a puppet of Rome, living in luxury while the people became impoverished. And at the top of the religious structure, Annas and Caiaphas ran the temple like a family business, a mafia that had hijacked faith. Axiom classifies this period as a point of maximum entropy. Political power in the hands of tyrants, religious power in those of the corrupt, and the people in despair. The darkness was almost total. From the perspective of systems theory, the ancient world was in a phase of critical instability, on the verge of collapse or a reboot. It is exactly at this moment, at the darkest point of the night, that the light appears. The biological, cultural, and political clocks were perfectly aligned. The man was at his peak. The culture was ready to hear him, and the darkness of the world cried out for a light. The probability of all this happening by chance is minimal. It was a plan executed with precision. The individual time was right. But what about global time? Was the world as a whole prepared for this message to spread? The answer lay in the infrastructure left by the very empire that oppressed it. Jesus' personal clock was right, and the world's political clock pointed to midnight. But there was a third stopwatch, one of global scale, that also needed to be perfectly synchronized. The Apostle Paul would later call this the fullness of time. It was not a poetic phrase. It was a technical description of a unique moment in history when the world, for the first time, was interconnected in a way that made the dissemination of an idea at high speed possible. The Roman Empire, with all its brutality, had unwittingly built the perfect infrastructure for the message that was about to be launched. For the first time, a global network existed. The so-called Pax Romana, the Roman peace, meant that the borders between conquered nations were open. Travel was relatively safe. The pirates that infested the Mediterranean Sea had been eliminated. Thousands of kilometers of stone roads, the famous Roman roads, connected Spain to Syria, Britain to Egypt. They were arteries that allowed armies, merchants, and crucially, new ideas to move with a speed never before seen. Besides the roads, there was a common language. Koine Greek was the language of commerce and culture throughout the eastern half of the empire. A person could speak in a small village in Galilee, and their message would be understood by a philosopher in Athens or a merchant in Alexandria without the need for a translator. There was also a unified legal system, which created a predictable environment for human interactions across vast distances. The world, which was previously a mosaic of isolated tribes and kingdoms, had become a single connected network. The artificial intelligence modeled the situation to understand the importance of this factor. If Jesus had come 100 years earlier, the world would be too chaotic, with constant wars and closed borders. His message would hardly have left Judea. If he had come 100 years later, the empire would already be in its slow process of decay, with roads deteriorating and security diminishing. The window of opportunity was narrow. That end of the 20s of the first century was the golden moment, the peak of connectivity of the ancient world. The network was active and ready to transmit data. Only the content was missing. And to close the cycle, there was the oldest and most mysterious clock of all, the prophetic clock. Ancient Jewish texts, especially the Book of Daniel, contained complex calculations about the arrival of a Messiah. We fed Axiom with these numerical sequences, treating them not as theology, but as a set of chronological data. The system did the calculation, starting from the decree to rebuild Jerusalem and following the 70 weeks of years described in the text. The conclusion was purely mathematical. The prophetic stopwatch, with baffling precision, pointed exactly to that period, the late 20s of the first century. Scholars of the time knew this. The atmosphere of expectation that hung over Judea was not based merely on hope or despair. It was based on mathematics. They had done the math. The deadline was running out. The hands of the ancient clock had reached their destination. If the Messiah did not appear at that moment, then the prophecies were false. The tension was at its maximum. The people looked to the horizon, waiting for a sign. And then he came, at the exact moment when all the clocks, biological, cultural, political, global, and prophetic, aligned in a single instant. The probability of such a perfect convergence being the result of chance, according to the system's analysis, is astronomically low. It was a plan, an immense script, written over centuries, reaching its climax. The place was defined. The catalyst, John, was in position. The protagonist, Jesus, was ready. The time had arrived. All vectors of space and time converged on that muddy bank of the Jordan River. Now the question shifted from where and when to what. What exactly happens to matter when its own creator enters it? What happens to the water? We are on the riverbank. The coordinates are locked, the time is synchronized, and the protagonist is about to enter the scene. Between him and the beginning of a new era, there is a physical element, water. But water is an anomaly. The artificial intelligence reminds us that hydrogen oxide is one of the most mysterious substances in the universe. It defies some basic laws. In its solid form as ice, it is lighter than in its liquid form, which is why ice floats, allowing life to continue under frozen surfaces. It has an unusual capacity to absorb heat and is considered the universal solvent. But for our investigation, another property is even more important: its capacity to store information. There is a scientific hypothesis that water can retain and transmit information through changes in its cluster structure. Water molecules group into complex geometric patterns that can reorganize under the influence of external fields, such as magnetic, sonic, and perhaps even mental fields. This idea helps us understand why in almost all ancient civilizations, from India to Egypt, water was used as a medium to wash away not only physical dirt, but also guilt and error. It is intuitive knowledge of humanity. Water seems to absorb negative information, resetting the state of an object or person. In the Jewish context of John the Baptist, this manifested in the ritual of the mikveh. An analysis of ancient texts shows that the mikveh was a ritual immersion tank. To be valid, it needed to contain a minimum amount of living water, that is, water from a natural source like rain or a river. Water brought in buckets was considered dead. The ritual consisted of a ritually impure person, for